It is a hot August afternoon at Swayze Lake. 1922, no, 1912. The sun sits heavy. Dragonflies flicker over the reeds. A family has spread a blanket on the sloping bank. The smell of frying fish and summer sweat hangs thick. 4-year-old Robert, Bobby Dunbar, runs along the dock, toes over the weathered wood, laughing. His parents, Leslie and Percy, call to him. You hear the call. You hear, then nothing. The board at the end of the dock rocks, empty. The laugh stops. They shout his name. They step into the shallows, into the reeds. They peel back water and weed and mud. A neighbor wades in. A boat rocks close by. No child, no cry. Only the close, insect-swirled air. What happened to Bobby Dunbar? This is still unanswered. I'm Elena Ward. Today, Bobby Dunbar. Listen to that lake again for a moment. Only the insects and the water. There aren't plucky detectives or flashing lights in this story at first. There's a family's small, private panic expanding outward until it engulfs a town, then a region, then a country. The world of 1912 didn't have Amber Alerts. It had newspapers, word of mouth, and, most dangerously, stories that wanted to be true. Before we go any further, a quick note about the show. Still Unanswered revisits cases where the official ending never feels like the end. We're less interested in closing the book and more interested in sitting inside the open page. Tonight, we'll trace Bobby's disappearance, the man arrested, the second mother who said, "That's my son," the courtroom, and a DNA test almost a century later that cracks the whole story open. And through it all, we'll ask, what do we do when grief and authority and the press collide? To help me with the historical and legal context is Dr. Marcus Llewellyn. Marcus, thanks for coming back on the show.
Alina, thank you for having me. This is one of those cases that sits heavy. It pulls at so many things I study: evidence, narrative, the ethics of certainty.
Let's start where every story of loss begins, with people who had names and ordinary lives. The Dunbars were from Opelousas, Louisiana. They were, for the time and place, comfortably middle class. Percy worked. He ran a small business. Leslie, took care of the household. Their son, Robert, called Bobby, was 4 in August 1912. A family with fishing poles and clean manners, and for one afternoon, the kind of trust that lets a child run along a dock. What changed that afternoon spilled out beyond those banks. Within hours, the search had expanded. Neighbors with lanterns, men combing the reeds, bloodhounds tracking across marsh and pines. And then the newspapers picked it up. Little descriptions printed and passed from town to town. In an age when a lost child could simply be swallowed by the landscape, the idea of a boy taken from his family lit a particular kind of fear.
Right. And when you say fear, it's important to note the cultural context. Early 20th century America, particularly the rural South, was a place where communities policed themselves through rumor as much as law. Papers served as the amplifier. A missing child story was, in a sense, the press's best fertilizer. It made shoots of suspicion grow into full-blown hysteria. People looked for a narrative that fit their anxieties: traveling strangers, vaudeville shows, anyone who didn't belong.
Which is how one sighting in Mississippi suddenly feels like the end of the line. A man named William Cantwell Walters, a tinker, itinerant, someone who mended pots and fixed fences, was seen traveling with a little boy. The boy was called Bruce Anderson, Walters said. He was barefoot. He was quiet. he had no comfortable place to stay, and some people said he resembled the missing Dunbar boy. Imagine being a parent who has spent days feeling that your life is a checkered map with a missing square. When there's even the slimmest hint your child has been seen, you take that road. The Dunbars took that road into Mississippi.
And that meeting, that's the fulcrum of the whole case. On one hand, you have a grieving middle-class family with friends, with a local sheriff who's sympathetic, and with press eager to deliver a happy ending. On the other, you have Walters, who has almost no social power, an itinerant working man, and a woman, Julia Anderson, who claims the boy is hers. She's from North Carolina, working class. No one makes space for her voice in the same way.
We should slow down there. Walters, the man traveling with the child, was taken into custody once the Dunbars and the sheriffs converged. He said the boy was Bruce, that the mother, Julia, had left him in Walters' care while she worked. Julia came to see her son, and then came one of those scenes that reads like a courtroom drama before there was a courtroom. They set the two women across from the boy, and history becomes a flipbook of small decisions. A bath is given, someone searches for scars, questions are asked in front of reporters. Early accounts are messy. Leslie hesitates. She doesn't immediately rush forward. Later, she becomes certain. Julia insists the boy is her child. The papers quickly deliver a headline, "Bobby Dunbar found." But what exactly was found?
This is where we must be careful with language. The word found suggests a return to what was, but identification, especially in that era, was not scientific. It rested on scars, on memory, on the way a mother might interpret a glance. There's also the phenomenon we see in many such cases, the pressure to make a decisive narrative. If you paced into a courtroom full of faces expecting resolution, you'd come to believe you'd seen what you needed to see. That doesn't mean that's what actually happened.
I want to read a moment from the contemporaneous reports because the way people wrote about the scene matters. One paper described Leslie's face as passing through various emotions, sorrow, doubt, hope, joy, before she finally pronounced the boy her child. Another account says Julia fell away from the crowd like a shadow. You can feel the press choosing which face is sympathetic and which is suspect. And listeners, we have to name the gendered and classed power at work. Leslie Dunbar was protected by social standing. Julia was not. In the papers, Leslie is the grieving mother reclaimed by kindness. Julia is an uncertain woman, a troublemaking figure. Those frames mattered tremendously in a courtroom.
Absolutely. The legal hearing that followed weighed testimony, more social testimony than forensic. Walters was charged with kidnapping. The prosecution leaned heavily on the Dunbars' conviction and the public opinion that had formed. The defense tried to assert Walters' narrative and Julia's claim. But the legal apparatus of the time tended to favor those with social legitimacy, and a jury drawn from that milieu is, unsurprisingly, predisposed in certain directions.
Walters was convicted and sent to prison. The boy who, for the rest of his life, was raised as Bobby Dunbar, returned to Opelousas. There was a legal ending. The state had declared the boy to be Robert Lee Dunbar. But I want to linger over the way you said that, Marcus. Social testimony. The identification relied on a patchwork. Scars, whether he responded to a name, whether he knew family routines, and whether a mother wanted to claim him. Those are fragile threads.
They're fragile, and they're also shaped by coercion of a sort. Picture the scene from the child's perspective. He's 4, maybe 5. He's been with an itinerant man, then taken to a town where strangers tell him his name is Bobby. Adults prod him with questions. He's bathed by people who talk about him like he's waited for this. Children are incredibly malleable. Sustained suggestion, "This is your mother, remember," can form memories as surely as anything else.
It's heartbreaking to imagine. Over the years, the story settles. The boy grows into a man named Bobby Dunbar. He goes to school, he takes a job, he marries, he raises children. His family tells the story as a miracle, the little boy lost and found. For them, everything feels resolved. I often think about how the world wants an ending. The community, too, wants a narrative it can believe in. And so a life grows around that narrative.
And that's the insidious thing about narratives that become legal fact. For the people in Bobby's life, the children he would become, the identity is not an abstraction. It's how you get bread, how neighbors speak to you, how you place your name on a marriage record. Legally, socially, the man is Bobby. But we have to separate legal identity from biological origins. At the time, they had no way to do that beyond testimony. There was no genetic test, no robust child welfare system, no national records that could instantly verify parentage.
Fast forward decades. The family story, as you say, is settled. Bobby becomes a patriarch, a grandfather. His grandchildren grow up on the story of the heroic recovery. Margaret, Bobby's granddaughter, lived in that story for years. Then, as an adult, she starts poking at the edges. She notices inconsistencies in newspaper reports. She reads about Julia Anderson. She sees the early hesitation. She decides to do something most descendants do not. She begins an archival search. Margaret's digging brings old court transcripts to light, brittle newspapers with different takes, and pieces that the family never wanted to examine closely. And she does something else. She arranges DNA testing. Now, Marcus, I want you to explain, for listeners who might not be geneticists, what kind of test this was and what it was expected to show.
Sure. Margaret contacted a genetic testing lab and arranged for comparisons between a descendant of Bobby, the man raised as Bobby, and a descendant of the Dunbar line, and separately between Bruce/Anderson descendants where possible. The central point was to see whether the man known as Bobby was biologically related to the Dunbar family. Modern DNA testing can detect parent-child relationships and more distant familial ties by comparing markers across the genome. If the man raised as Bobby were truly a Dunbar biologically, the test would show a pattern of shared DNA consistent with that relationship.
And it did not.
It did not. The result, if the tests and the chain of custody were properly handled, was that the man who lived as Bobby Dunbar did not share the expected genetic ties with the Dunbar bloodline. In other words, the simplest interpretation is that he was not biologically related to Leslie and Percy Dunbar. That strongly supports the possibility that he was, in fact, the boy known as Bruce Anderson.
I remember sitting in my kitchen the first time I read the results. There's a specific kind of silence that follows a revelation like that. It isn't just curiosity, it's sorrow. For Julia Anderson, the DNA results were a belated vindication. For the Dunbar family, it was, how do you unlearn the story that raised your family? For historians, it's a jarring case study of how identity can be imposed and how systems, courts, press, communities can settle an identity in place of messy truth.
And there's another layer. Walters, who served his time, maintained his innocence until his death. He always said, according to his supporters, that he was helping a woman, that he had a boy left in his care. Convicted of kidnapping under the weight of public opinion, he died with that conviction on his record. The DNA results don't, in any sense, exonerate or condemn him conclusively for criminality. They complicate the moral account. If the boy was indeed Julia's child, Walters may have been doing what he thought was right, but the legal system went the other way.
So we arrive at a fork in the road. One question addresses identity. Was the man Bobby biologically a Dunbar? And another, darker question asks, what happened to the real Bobby? If the man raised as Bobby was not the biological son, then where did the biological Bobby go? Did he drown in Swayze Lake that August day? Was there foul play we never saw? Is there even evidence left to follow?
There are a handful of possibilities. The simplest is tragic. Bobby drowned and was never recovered. Lakes swallow small children. Evidence decays. Another possibility is that someone else took him, an abduction, wholly separate from Walters traveling with a boy. Or there is the uncomfortable idea of a cover-up, an attempt by someone to hide an accident. The problem is that none of these theories have incontrovertible evidence. A century of time erodes the material we would use to test them.
The human thing that haunts me, beyond the legal and the papers, is the inner life of the man who was raised as Bobby. What did he think? Did he ever feel a gap inside? A name that didn't take? Did he, at some point, meet Julia and see recognition? Some accounts say he never doubted he was Bobby. Some family members say he loved his family without reservation. That matters. Even if he was Bruce by birth, the life he knew, his memories, his relationships, were real for him.
Exactly. Identity has layers: biological, social, psychological. You can be raised in a family and internalize its identity so completely that altering that narrative is profoundly destabilizing. We should be careful before imposing a single moral judgment. There's also the matter of agency. A child's consent is not meaningful in these decisions. If a child is shifted from one parent to another by adult authority, irrespective of biology, that's ethically fraught.
It's ethically fraught and heartbreakingly human. Let's return to Julia for a minute. Her story in the press is heartbreaking for a different reason. In 1912, her claims were framed as less credible precisely because she was poor and female. Papers implied she might be unstable or immoral. I don't want to reduce her to a symbol. She was a woman who said, "That's my boy," and then had her claim disregarded. The DNA test, decades later, offers her a kind of belated justice. But it doesn't fix what she lost. Years with a child she said was hers.
It doesn't. And this is where the law reveals its limits. Courts can decide custody or criminality based on the best evidence available at the time. But the cultural forces, who's believed, who's broadcast, whose grief is legible, shape those decisions. A poor woman's word against a middle-class couple's is not merely a matter of testimony. It's a structural bias embedded in the machinery of adjudication.
Marcus, you've spent a lot of time thinking about wrongful convictions and the role of evidence. When you look at the Bobby Dunbar case, what lessons do you see for how modern systems should or shouldn't handle identity disputes?
Several lessons. First, the weight of public pressure on legal processes can produce miscarriages or at least misattributions of justice. Second, the lack of objective biological testing at the time created a vacuum filled by spectacle. Soud, nowadays DNA can resolve many paternity or identity questions, but we must use it ethically. Third, the case shows the importance of preserving records and voices that might, at the time, be sidelined. If Julia's records and testimony had been treated with more credence, we might have avoided decades of a misattributed identity. And finally, there's a moral imperative. When we discover such errors, we have to reconcile with the people whose lives were built on them. That's complicated and painful.
Painful is the right word. When Margaret Dunbar Cutright ordered the DNA test, part of what she did was an act of curiosity, but it was also an act of moral searching. She had to choose whether to potentially uproot her family's story. That takes courage. And when the DNA said there was no family match, it forced a reckoning. Margaret didn't write a sensational headline. She pursued a truth that would not necessarily make anyone feel better.
And that's critical. People often ask, why reopen these old wounds? My answer is that truth matters to the people who lived it, and it matters to how we understand ourselves historically. The Dunbar family's sense of identity was built partially on an error that hurt another family. Acknowledging that is a way of honoring the lives we otherwise might continue to make false. But it is also, and importantly, an invitation to ask, what else have we settled prematurely because it was convenient?
Which takes us back to our show's title, Still Unanswered. For all the revelations, the one question that refuses to be tucked away is simple and cold. Where is the real Bobby? We do not have a good answer. The DNA test suggests the boy raised as Bobby was not the biological child of Leslie and Percy. That strongly implies that a separate, unnamed tragedy occurred at Swayze Lake. Did he drown? Was there foul play? Or has his body, or his trace, simply been lost to time? We don't know.
And we may never know. Time is both an ally and an enemy to truth. It protects us from certain pains by blurring them. It destroys evidence during the blur. But that doesn't absolve us of responsibility. In the face of unresolved histories, we can still pay attention to patterns, how power operates, whose voices are prioritized, how certainty gets manufactured.
I want to end this episode not with a tidy moral, but with a simple image. Think of Julia, years after the court case, sitting in a kitchen in North Carolina. Maybe she's darning a sock. Maybe the day's light is low. She has a life she made, but there's a space always arranged at the edges of her days for a boy she said was hers. And then think of Bobby's grandchildren, the people who grew up with a man named Bobby who was the center of their world, learning that part of their family history was a mistake. Both images are true in their own way. Both images make you ache. Marcus, before we close, one more quick question. For listeners who feel unsettled and want to do something, learn more, or understand how these errors happen, where should they start? What should they be looking for in the stories they read?
Start with skepticism towards easy endings. Notice who's telling the story and who's absent from it. Pay attention to language. When reports describe someone as unreliable or immoral without evidence, ask why. Support archival work. These records are how we eventually get to more complicated truths. And finally, when modern science offers revision, accept that revision as part of history's proper work. It's not betrayal, it's correction.
Thank you, Marcus. As always, the work of being honest about the past is uncomfortable, but necessary. Before we go, a note on sources. Much of tonight's narrative comes from contemporary newspaper accounts, court records, and the work Margaret Dunbar Cutright did to assemble the DNA evidence and civil record comparisons. We tried to stay as faithful as possible to those primary sources. If you want a reading list or links to the records, check the episode notes. There's a bibliography there for anyone who wants to follow the trail more closely. This case does not give us neat closure, and that's why we brought it here. It's a story about grief, power, the court of public opinion, and a technological test that, nearly a century later, forced a community to admit that the story they wanted was incomplete. If you found tonight's episode unsettling, and I hope you did, consider subscribing to Still Unanswered. We bring you cases like this, the ones that stick in your craw, the ones that make you reconsider what you thought you knew about justice and memory. For now, imagine Swayze Lake at dusk. The reeds lean into themselves. The water eats light. Somewhere beneath that surface, maybe, there is an answer we cannot reach. And that absence shapes nearly everything that followed. I'm Elena Ward. This was Still Unanswered. Today, Bobby Dunbar. Good night.
Good night.